Welcome to Midnight in America, your source for the most provocative global affairs content on the internet. This week's guest is Riccardo Pelizzo of Nazarbayev University, who will be discussing the prospects and challenges of Africa's development. It's Midnight in America, 4 p.m. in Sydney, Australia. Riccardo Pelizzo, what time is it where you are?
Hello, Salvatore. Good morning. It's actually 6 a.m. here in Verona.
6 a.m. Well, thank you for getting up early to do
Yes.
I really appreciate it. But we're not going to talk about Verona today. We're actually going to talk about Africa. And can I start by just asking, what draws you to Africa? Why are you so interested in studying development in Africa?
Well, because, many African countries, as everybody knows, are not as rich as United States, Italy, Germany, France, Japan.
Right.
And obviously, if you're interested in development, it makes more sense to study development in a developing country or for a developing country rather than doing that for a developing one. So,
I know you made your name as a political scientist studying European party politics, but your books on Africa seem to focus much more on development than on political parties and political systems. Is there a reason?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's very interesting. But I was working on European party and political parties and party politics when I started my career as political scientist, and then I started doing work on parliaments, and that widened the scope of my research to other areas. And as part of that, and thanks to World Bank, I spent a lot of time in Africa collecting data, write some of the books that I did for World Bank. And so, I got to know the place, I got to know the region. And so for me was that line of research branched out in two directions. On the one hand, after looking at what parliaments can do to fight corruption, I became more interested in studying corruption and so forth and so on. And the other part was we were doing that with a clear purpose in mind. The reason why you want to improve the quality of government, the reason why you want to curb corruption, the reason why you want to have a functioning parliament is because you want to make sure that developing countries develop. And so for me, it was a natural next step to take, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Right now, Africa obviously is a big place, and we often forget how big it is because on map Africa is near the equator, and so it appears small, and Canada appears enormous. But in fact, Africa is a big place.
Yes.
If we're going to talk about development, I mean, do you want to narrow it down, and we'll start with talking about one particular country or region, or how would you like to approach the topic? Is it best to focus on one region in particular?
Well, I mean, there are, yes. I mean, I know a little bit East Africa better than other parts of Africa because, I have several friends there and I spent some time there doing research in 2014. So it's a region that I know well, but even though I travel also extensively for work to West Africa, but I think that we need to say this, which is that there are some problems that are country-specific, and there are some problems that are actually common throughout Africa. So even though Africa is a big continent, very diverse, with a lot of languages, different ethnic groups, and different religions, in reality, some problems are, cut across the whole continent, and that's why it's possible to speak, quote unquote, of Africa's problems.
So what sort of problems? I mean, what do you see as the barriers to development for the continent as a whole?
Well, you studied with Giovanni Arrighi at Johns Hopkins, and he wrote a very successful piece in 2002, 2003 on the African crisis, where he said, Africa was very successful economically, was growing very fast in the 60s and up to the mid 70s, and then it entered a phase in which the economy was not doing so well, and so he tried to explain what went wrong. In reality, the timing of the publication was peculiar because that was exactly the point in time in which African fortunes were switching. Rather, around 2000, African economies started booming and at very high rates of growth. So for example, I'll give you the case of Tanzania. By 2001, the GDP per capita, the gross national income per capita was about $300, 310, 320. And in 10 years, 12 years, it tripled. So, so these countries became much richer, continent-wide. GDP per capita went from $500 to 1,500. Life expectancy increased, infant mortality decreased. So whatever development indicators you use, that points to the fact that Africa did develop. And the reason why Africa was able to develop is because there was a combination of facilitating conditions. The international community cut down the foreign debt that African countries own to lenders, and that slowed down economic growth. More aid started to come here. The way in which aid was disbursed changed. The approach of the international community switched from a structural adjustment to PRSP, which is the poverty strategy, poverty reduction strategy program, which basically allowed countries to have ownership of how they wanted to tackle their own problems, their own issues. And the fourth, another important issue was that the amount of foreign direct investments increased 38 times.
38 times?
Yeah, 3,800%. Yes, 38 times. So you have a massive inflow of aid and capital from multinational corporations, private investors, and so forth and so on. And so you have all these very positive conditions. And there are two more factors that helped Africa. One is that China developed. And China, as you know better than anybody else, had fantastic economic performance, developing in its own right. And so it had a great demand for commodities. And so a lot of commodities from Africa were exported to China. China was a big market for African commodities. And the price of commodities for the past 15 years has been very high. And so that allowed African countries to have very high revenue, and that also was a factor. So all these things put together allowed Africa to experience 15 years of very high, very rapid, very solid economic growth. But things seems to be changing. And so I get now to your question, what's going wrong? Well, I think that my impression is that there's mounting or increasing instability. South Sudan, the civil conflict between the president Machar and Salvatore and the leader of the rebel Machar and the other rebel groups doesn't seem to be coming to an end. It was portrayed as a conflict between the Dinka population and non-Dinka population, but even within the Dinka population, there are very bitter conflicts. There have been human rights violations, crimes, atrocities perpetrated for years. 2 million people have been displaced. So, the country is totally devastated economically, socially, and it's very, very unstable. Instability seems to be characterizing also the situation in Kenya, where after a very tense, very bitter electoral campaign that pitted President Kenyatta against Raila Odinga, the country is bitterly divided because both parties claim to have won the election, and so the opposition does not recognize Kenyatta, and even though according to the law, he's the winner of the election, and so Kenya is very destabilized. Odinga was sworn in as the people's president, and therefore the fact that the government and the opposition can't find a way to work their differences out and strike a deal is a very destabilizing issue for Kenya. And that's very problematic because even though it's not always appropriate to speak as Africa as a single entity, what makes Africa perform well or not depends on how well Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa perform. And right now the situation is not very positive because South Africa just replaced the president Zuma that was accused of various corruption crimes, and so it is not clear where South Africa is going, and the South African economy has not been doing too well for the past couple of years. The instability has hurt Kenya's economy, and because of the low commodity prices, Nigeria has been in trouble for the last 2 or 3 years, not to mention the fact that President Buhari for a while was sick. And so all these conditions, I think, legitimately raise some doubts as to how well Africa will be able to do on the way forward, because there's a lower demand for commodities. The price of commodities is lower. There's growing political instability. One thing that is not always mentioned by social scientists like us, but is well known to by public health scholars, is that the number of the incidence of tropical diseases and the neglected tropical decreases is increasing. So when all the things were going well for Africa, it was also able to make progress tackling and reducing pandemics, epidemics, and the spread of various diseases. This seems to be changing, and so I was just looking, for example, yesterday at the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a cholera outbreak affected more than 50,000 people since November. And so the fact that the health situation is somewhat deteriorating, the international community is changing, the fact that there's lower demand for goods, the fact that perhaps there's also less aid money available for African countries. All these seems to be affecting Africa's chances to keep growing. And so for me, it's not entirely clear whether Africa would be able to capitalize upon its recent success, or whether it's going to go back to having another phase of slower growth and less progress on the developmental path.
Right. Well, we often hear about this commodities super cycle associated with the development of China, that for 20 years commodities prices were extremely high, all sorts of commodities, as China consumed vast quantities of all sorts of minerals. And with China's growth slowing today, obviously commodities prices have come down dramatically, including oil, but also many minerals that we don't really think much about, but which are the bread and butter of African development. To what extent is Africa still simply a commodities economy? Is all the growth of the last 15 years simply because of high commodities prices? Now that that's over, growth is over.
No, I mean, that's where the between countries differences come in.
Okay.
Of course, for countries like Angola, Nigeria, which where the economy is oil dependent, obviously the price of oil is a key factor.
Right.
And so the fact that the price of oil drops, it's a big problem, affects in a very negative way their economic performance. But there are other countries like Ethiopia, where in reality the economic growth was triggered by the investment in infrastructures, and actually paradoxically for a country like Ethiopia, the fact that the price of commodity has dropped is very important, because they can have, for example, be able to buy oil for a lower price, and that's beneficial to their economic performance. So we have two different models. So not all African countries were hit negatively by the decline in prices of the commodities. But for the most part, most countries are commodities dependent, and they don't seem to have a terribly diversified economies. But that said, one of the interesting things that I think we as social scientists don't pay enough attention to is that Africa in the last 20 years had made great progress with its tourism industry.
Okay.
Yes, and so most people don't know that, but in a country like Tanzania, usually tourism industry contributes between 4 and 9% to the GDP.
That's pretty substantial. I know you have quite some deep expertise on African tourism yourself, and
yeah, well,
how do you see is tourism going to be a major growth industry for Africa in the next generation?
Yes, I really think so. I think because I think that Africa can offer various types of tourism products, in the sense that leaving South Africa aside, because South Africa is a very modern, very sophisticated country that has many things to offer. But you have East African countries like Kenya and Tanzania, that can offer a sand and beach kind of tourism, but they can also offer the safari. West African countries, Togo, Benin, Ghana, Mali, they have a very long and very rich cultural tradition. So you can go to Mali and see, Timbuktu, the ancient library. You can go to Janneh and see the mosque, which is this beautiful architectural masterpiece. You can go to Ghana, Togo, Benin, and discover the local, the very rich local tradition and religions. So basically, you can go to different parts of Africa depending on what your interests are. And so, I think they have, not to mention that Seychelles, Mauritius, Capo Verde are very successful places where you can go to enjoy sun, beach, and whatever.
Well, let me press you a little bit here. You're a real adventure tourist, and I remember I was blown away by the fact that you once hiked with your family from the coast of Africa to Timbuktu in the interior, following the old caravan routes. Most of us are not going to do that sort of thing. And for me, as a very risk-averse tourist, the two things the two red flags that go up in my head when I hear African tourism are fears about disease and fears about violence. Are those going to hold back the development of tourism in Africa, or is that just too much a generalization? In different, some countries are safe and disease-free and will succeed with tourism?
Well, I mean, there are some countries that are safe and disease-free, like Capo Verde, Mauritius, Seychelles, South Africa. There's no diseases, and there's except for some parts, perhaps of Johannesburg, there's no.
But most of us,
violence. So
most of us don't want to risk malaria just to take a beach holiday.
Yeah, right. There are several countries in Africa where you don't have malaria. For example, WHO, I think in 2014, basically said that even in mainland Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, the city is malaria-free. Okay. So the risk of actually contracting malaria is lower than the risk of a health damage that you can get from taking the anti-malaria pills. So the health issue is very different. Then of course, if you say I want to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, I want to go to South Sudan, then the health situation is dramatically worse, and so that represents a serious problem. But there are various parts of the country. I would say Kenya itself, especially along the coast, does not doesn't have a high risk of malaria.
So
on the other hand, so unless you go for a safari, in which case you better take your pills. That said, the violence thing goes back to what I was saying before, to political instability. Okay. If you have unstable political systems and you have political factions, political groups clashing and engaging in politically motivated violence, that prevents the government and the state apparatus from functioning the way it should. Okay. And so, among other things, you're not going to monitor the territory, and so you can have pockets of violence, of crime taking place, and that, of course, might deter tourism. So I'm a strong believer that yes, tourism could be one of the great engines of economic growth in the continent, but it is essential for African countries to become stabilized and to reduce the risk of crime and violent activities. I mean, to give you one example, Kenya in 2011 reached attracted the highest number of tourists in its history. It was a very successful year, but then the country started experiencing some very high crime rate in the coastal region between around Malindi, Watamu, Mombasa, Lamu, and so forth and so on. And so immediately the number of tourists going to Kenya dropped, because you don't want to go to a place which is potentially harmful and dangerous. Right. And so, there was a little bit of a problem for Kenya. So there's no question that they need to provide security, political stability and security for the tourists. And with some improvements in public health, I think that many countries in the continent can become very attractive destinations for international tourists. And as the continent grows, there's going to be a higher number of African tourists going to other African countries for their holidays.
Right. Now, so for those of you who may be listening live onto the live stream right now, get out your pencil. I'm about to give out the call-in line, the number to call us if you'd like to actually ask a question of Riccardo Pelizzo. So get out your pens now. I'll give out the number in just a moment. But Riccardo, I do want to ask you one other question about tourism before we move on, because this really is connected to governance as well. You're Italian, and I seem to remember that it was Julius Caesar who drained the marshes near Rome in order to prevent malaria in Rome and end malaria with no pills, no quinine, just simple civil engineering and good governance to suppress malaria in Rome. Correct me if it wasn't Julius Caesar, but I think it was Julius Caesar. In any case, it was more than 2,000 years ago. Malaria was, if not conquered in Rome, at least mostly eliminated in the city of Rome. If that could be done with Roman engineering 2,000 years ago, why is it such a challenge for governments to do it now? And before you answer that question, quickly, the call-in line is in the United States, area code 412-567-6798. That's U.S. area code 412-567-6798. We'd love to hear from you. Riccardo, can we solve malaria?
I hope so. Yes, I hope so. I think that it requires a multi-pronged intervention. We need to do some kind of the things that were done, for example, in Italy, maybe not 2,000 years ago, but Italy had the malaria problems when Italy unified because the then Italian Prime Minister, Cavour, went to Rome, contracted malaria, and died.
Oh, really? Cavour died of malaria?
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah. But later on, in the 20s and the 30s, various parts of Italy that had malaria, so not just around Rome, but also in Emilia-Romagna, where you had all the swamps around what eventually became the Lido di Spina and the Lidi Ferraresi. And that was an area that was completely infested with malaria. And by clearing up and cleaning up the place, malaria was eradicated. And so, but that was made possible by the fact that the Italian governments of that period took steps to develop the infrastructure that were required to eradicating the problem. And I think that that's also something that should be attempted here. Also, there's a big difference here between the urban areas and the fact that, you have very expensive land size, which is more difficult to treat because if you're in the savannah, you cannot spray with DDT, and even creating proper, water courses or whatever to prevent the mosquitoes to reproduce is going to be a challenge because malaria is the one that has the highest incident and has a very high mortality rate. I was talking. I think that last year Burundi had a couple of million, or 40% of the population got malaria. So
wow, 40%. So it just becomes a disease burden that everybody gets it several times over the course of their lives.
Oh, well, that goes without saying. But sometimes, as the case of Burundi last year, they had this. The mortality was not fortunately very high, but the malaria disease pretty much got it. Everybody got it. So I think it was 40% of the population got it, and that does create a problem. That does create a problem. So I think that something should be done, and also it would be great if at some point we started having some proper vaccines that can be used. Because once we were able to develop that kind of vaccine, you vaccinate the people, and that will almost by itself contribute to eliminating the disease.
Right. Now, again, I want to announce the call-in line one last time. Don't be shy. Just go ahead and dial the number and give us a call. That's US 412-567-6798. Riccardo, let's move beyond malaria and talk about what what do we need for the future in African development? Is it just all about investment, or is it about better governance, or what is your prescription to countries that are seeking to join the middle income ranks of the global economy?
Well, I mean, most African countries have enormous underground resources. So if they only learn to manage their underground resources properly, there is no reason why this country shouldn't be much richer, much more developed than they are. There's no question about it.
By underground, do you mean literally minerals under the ground, or do you mean not exploited, like people's entrepreneurial?
No, I literally mean underground.
Under the ground. So, okay.
Yeah. Well, and this is not. And what I'm saying is, I don't think it's a fantasy. I think it's real. And I think that the case of Zimbabwe confirms what I'm saying. Zimbabwe, when Zimbabwe was able to manage its natural resources properly, it was a thriving economy. And on top of that, it had a very successful agricultural sector. Now Zimbabwe's agricultural sector is struggling to almost to feed its own population, and there's some evidence that the underground wealth was not managed properly, and that several billions worth of diamonds disappeared, and so they didn't generate any income for the country, and so obviously that incident alone is not sufficient to turn around the fortunes of Zimbabwe, but the fact that at some point Zimbabwe was run properly and then was run less properly or very improperly, depending on how one to judge Mugabe, obviously has serious implications for the economic and developmental fortunes of a country like Zimbabwe. And I think that the same story is true everywhere. I think that Africa needs better governance, but to have better governance, it needs to have simultaneously better institutions and better leadership.
Okay.
Because what we're seeing in the country between the two political leaders, government and opposition, in Kenya, the conflict that we're seeing in South Sudan between the president and the leaders and the various leaders of the various rebel groups, the behavior of President Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we have a lot of political leaders that don't seem to be exactly the kind of leaders that African countries will need to make the kind of progress they should be making. And so, I think that selecting, nurturing, grooming a new generation of different leaders that that understand that their mission is to serve the country, not to be served by the country, will be very, very, very important.
Right. Can I ask you, we hear a lot about the mobile phone revolution in Africa and how, micro payments and, access to information technology are going to transform the continent. Do you think there's any substance to that, or is that just a lot of hype?
No, I mean, there's no question that the way in which the phones are used in Africa is impressive. You can pay your bills on the phone. You can charge your electricity. You can do anything. You don't just use the phone to talk with your friends or to be on WhatsApp and to communicate with your close one. You can use it for bank transactions. So paradoxically, when you open a bank account in, I guess, in the United States or in Australia, you can go to the bank or you can do your transactions online. But here, even before you get your online account here in Africa, I mean, you get all the information on the phone. So the phone is the most common, most successful means of communications and to do transaction and business and whatever. So I think it has a lot of potential. Whether the hype is justified or not, I'm not sure, because this can obviously speed up communication and transactions and whatever. But another thing that I think Africa needs is more research and more innovation, because as countries develop, they need to develop different things. At first you need to mobilize resources, then you need to mobilize your resources in a more efficient way, And then, you need to transform your economy. And to transform your economy, you need the technology, innovation, research, and so forth and so on. And I don't think many African countries at the moment are doing much in that respect. And I give you some World Bank data. Usually, one of the ways in which we estimate whether and how well a country is doing research-wise is to look at the number of patents applications that are filed within the country. I believe that in the last year for which data were available, Tanzania had 1, Uganda had 9, and Kenya had 137.
Okay.
And so you can see that, and that's a relatively small number because, as you know, China is producing hundreds of thousands or millions of patents on a yearly basis. Japan is also very active in that respect. And so I think that for Africa to keep on this virtuous pattern of growth and development, I think that the research capacity of the research institution, universities and independent research centers has to improve and start to come up with a real original innovation. And I don't think that the phone revolution is sufficient to do that. I think we need something more than just that. But that's my personal view. I may be wrong.
So we're going to have to start wrapping up. I mean, we can talk for hours, but the show is half an hour, and we've already kind of reached the end of the show. But I'd like to just, broadly ask you, do you have any final thoughts or any directions, practical steps that you would advise, countries, politicians, leaders, corporations to take, that would really promote African development? Or particularly, or development in any particular country, if you have any particular examples.
Well, I don't know how much my opinion is worth, but I think that those African countries that can afford and have the means and the resources and the landscape and everything to make the tourism industry work, they should really make sure that the tourism industry works, because that will allow them to have more export, faster economic growth, more foreign exchange, foreign currencies, and so on. And the capital, the revenue that is generated by this growing and developing a tourism industry could be put to good use to do all those other things that are necessary, because you need to start from somewhere, and obviously I think this approach is more virtuous than what some countries like Kenya are doing, which is that they're expanding once again their debt, which might, in the not so long run, undermine whatever accomplishment they have accomplished. So I really believe that you have to work on your strengths, and manage better the resources. That's a key issue. And also I think African countries, they need to get some help to groom a new generations of leaders with a different mentality, because sometimes the people in position of leadership, and I don't speak just about the people that are in government, that I don't meet very often, but also the people that work in research organizations or universities. Once they reach this position that are obviously fairly well paid, socially prestigious, they think that they have a sense of the entitlement. Well, they should understand that they're, why they should be proud of what they've accomplished. Those roles are positions of service, and they're there to do something that will contribute to their country well-being, and not just to their personal one, because that's not the way it should be. I don't think at least.
Well, I think that's an ethic that we can communicate to people in developed countries as well. All of us have the opportunity to have the kinds of lives we do. Riccardo Pelizzo, thank you very much for appearing on Midnight in America. I do appreciate it. It's great to have you on the program. Next week we'll be back. Thank you. And next week we'll be back with another show. So please join us 1 week from now again on Midnight in America. Thanks, everybody.